the first part of this lecture on the church and the state, I suggested that we need to rethink the relationship between the church and the state as we enter more deeply into post-Christendom. Now I want to continue to think about this issue by engaging the story of Jesus and Pilate, asking what we can learn from this story to help the church understand our relationship to the state in a post-Christendom world. I believe that the scene of Pilate's interrogation of Jesus provides us critical insight into the relationship between the church and the state for the early 21st century. What we see here is a scene in which a worldly ruler, the symbol of the state, encounters Jesus, the representative of a very different rule. And we need to pay careful attention to this passage in order to get a clearer vision of the call of the church to be present in the world. The scene is depicted most clearly in John 18 and 19 and in Luke 22. And in this scene, Jesus makes a series of statements that show us how he understood the nature of the state and the contrast between the state and the kingdom of God. The first statement is found in John 18:36, where Jesus states, "My kingdom is not of this world." The statement has sometimes been interpreted to say that Jesus only cares about our spiritual life, that Christianity doesn't have anything to say about our material life, our life in the world, and that this isn't a concern to Christ. This has created apolitical readings of Jesus' mission, readings which I believe are deeply flawed. So what does Jesus mean by this phrase? The statement comes in the dialogue between Pilate and Jesus that begins in John 18:33, with Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This is the question that Pilate needs answered because this is his deep concern. When you boil it down, Pilate has one job: to maintain the rule of Rome against all threats. And one of the great threats in Israel are the zealots, those in the Jewish community who see armed insurrection as the way to overthrow Rome in order to establish the Jewish kingdom. So Pilate is very vigilant regarding this threat, and he wants to know what Jesus is claiming. If Jesus is claiming to be the king of the Jews, to be one who would establish a new political rule in Jerusalem, then he is a person that Pilate must deal with. And so he asks Jesus straight out, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And to this, Jesus responds, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now, there's an obvious question that arises here. What does Jesus mean by "my kingdom"? Clearly, Jesus is creating a contrast here, saying, "My kingdom is not like your kingdom, Pilate. Your kingdom is of this world. It is a kingdom that is rooted in worldliness and strives for the goals of the world: power and wealth, control, prestige, and all of these according to worldly criteria. But my kingdom," Jesus says, "is not like this. My kingdom is not the rule of humans who are striving for earthly control and glory. My kingdom is the rule of God, and God's rule is a completely different rule." Now, this isn't to say that it is not earthly, but it is to say that it's not worldly. Human kingdoms are worldly because they are built on violence, exploitation, competition, human military strength, struggles for power, the accumulation of wealth. But Christ's kingdom, the kingdom of God, is a way of being in the world that is different than the way of being of worldly kingdoms. So because of this, Jesus' way of being in the world is confusing to Pilate. Pilate is trying to assess Jesus according to the criteria of his rule. He is trying to assess whether or not Jesus is a threat to his rule, is a threat to the rule of Rome. And Pilate comes up with an answer when he says, "This man is innocent. I find nothing against him." Pilate concludes that Jesus is innocent. Pilate has seen many rebels before. It is his job to evaluate and to eliminate rebels. Pilate has seen zealots before, those who would overthrow Rome. But as Jesus stands before him, Pilate knows this is no zealot. This man is not a revolutionary. This is not a man who intends to lead an army to overthrow Rome. This is not a man who has his eye on my throne. This man is a crackpot who goes on about a non-worldly kingdom, but he's not guilty of insurrection. For Pilate, ruling is all about the weapons of this world. And if this man isn't going to take up those weapons, then he is no threat. And Pilate is right. Jesus isn't intent on raising an army. He isn't intent on leading a rebellion against Rome. In fact, he says this. He says, "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight." Why don't they fight? Well, Peter tried to fight. Do you remember what happened? Jesus rebuked Peter. Why the rebuke? Because Jesus is stating very clearly that violence is the means of worldly states to protect their rule, to protect their power, but violence is not the means of establishing the kingdom of God. Because his kingdom is not a kingdom of competitive power, but of love. Jesus is making it clear that what's happening here in the scene between himself and Pilate is not a conflict between two worldly cultures that are competing with each other to rule. And Jesus also says this in Luke's gospel: "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with clubs and swords?" Jesus is essentially saying, as he is being arrested, "I'm not a threat to your rule, Pilate. I'm not leading a rebellion to overthrow your power." And what Jesus means by this is that he is not seeking to replace one form of earthly government with another. Right? Every rebellion in the earthly realm leads ultimately to the next rebellion. This is the way of political power. Jesus' life, in this sense, isn't an attack on one worldly power by another worldly power. This isn't an attack by one worldly kingdom on another worldly kingdom in competition for worldly kingdom power. Therefore, when Jesus' servant takes up swords, he tells them that they aren't to use swords. They aren't to use the means of worldly power to enforce Jesus' rule, because his rule cannot be brought in by or enforced by worldly power, because his rule is not of this world. Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God isn't like Pilate's rule or any other East of Eden rule. It doesn't mean that Jesus' kingdom has no earthly effects, but it does mean that Jesus' kingdom is not merely a better version of earthly kingdoms with better laws or better morality, better organization. It means that Jesus' kingdom doesn't value the things that worldly kingdoms value, doesn't seek the things that worldly kingdoms seek. And so the church is a political entity, but not one that belongs to the old. Nation states are the organization of human life according to the old. The kingdom of God is the organization of human life according to the new. The church is called to be present in this world, but not to give herself to the things of this world. And this is our political task as the church, to be ambassadors of God's rule, who understand our mission as those who are sent from our home nation, the kingdom of God, to proclaim the reality of that kingdom and to call people out of their worldly citizenship to be citizens of God's kingdom.